The elephant throne had changed little in 3,000 years, but never before had it supported the weight of so alien a visitor. As the star Homer stared into the south, it compared the half-kilometre wide columns soaring from the mountain peak with the feats of engineering it had seen on other worlds. For such a young race, this was, indeed, impressive. Though it seemed always on the point of toppling from the sky, it had stood now for 15 centuries. Not, of course, in its present form. The first 100 kilometres was now a vertical city, still occupied at some of its widely spaced levels, through which the 16 sets of tracks had often carried 1 million passengers a day. Only 2 of those tracks were operating now. In a few hours, the Star Homer and its escorts would be racing up that huge fluted column on the way back to the ring city that encircled the globe. The Homer averted its eyes to give telescopic vision and slowly scanned the zenith. Yes, there it was, hard to see by day but easy by night, when the sunlight streaming past the shadow of Earth still blazed upon it. The thin, shining band that split the sky into 2 hemispheres was a whole world into itself, where 500 million humans had opted for permanent zero-gravity life. And up there, beside Ring City, was the starship that had carried the envoy and all the other companions of the hive across the interstellar gulfs. Even now it was being readied for departure, not with any sense of urgency, but several years ahead of schedule in preparation for the next 600-year lap of its journey. That would represent no time at all to the Star Homer, of course, for it would not reconjugate until the end of the voyage. But now it was on the snow-dusted summit of Yakigala, facing mankind's pathway to the stars. It summoned the children to its side. They always understood when it really wished to be obeyed, and pointed to the mountain in the south. "You know perfectly well," it said with an exasperation that was only partly feigned, "that Earthport 1 was built 2,000 years later than this ruined palace." The children all nodded in solemn agreement. "Then why," asked the Star Homer, tracing the line from the zenith down to the summit of the mountain, "why do you call that column the Tower of Kalidasa?" Welcome to Science Fiction with Damien Walter, an ongoing exploration not only of the very best in science fiction storytelling, but of what happens when reality meets fantasy, when reason meets emotion, when logos meets mythos, and when science meets fiction. And I can think of very few, or perhaps none at all, better examples, both of the very best in science fiction storytelling and of all of those colliding elements that we are exploring here, than the novel that I want to discuss today, which is The Fountains of Paradise by Arthur C Clarke. Before leaping into that work of fiction, though, a little bit of housekeeping. We're coming to the end of the first season of the science fiction podcast, which has indeed been an exploration both of content and of form. I've been discovering what the science fiction podcast is whilst recording something over the first year of episodes here. And I would like to include a question and answer within the first season, because I'm increasingly getting questions from listeners of the podcast, and I want to dedicate an episode, probably quite a long episode, I think, into answering some of those questions. So please ask me your questions, and the best place to do that, you can do it on the Facebook community, for the Science Fiction Podcast. We have just passed 20,000 members, so go along and join the Facebook community. You will find a pinned thread there for questions, but the best place is to come and ask me on Twitter. I am at Damien, D-A-M-I-E-N, G Walter, W-A-L-T-E-R, Damien G. Walter on Twitter. Come along, follow me on Twitter, and leave your questions there for me. There will also be a pinned tweet, and you can use hashtag, let's say, AskDamo. And I will gather together questions over the next week, and the next episode of the Science Fiction Podcast will be answers to those questions, some or many of which may arise from today's episode on The Fountains of Paradise by Arthur C Clarke. I'm not quite sure what I want to say about The Fountains of Paradise, something that my critics say to me when they disagree with something I've said is that I am at least very good at organizing my ideas, which is the kind of compliment of faint praise that you sometimes get from people who disagree with the conclusion to that organizational process. But when it comes to this book, I've somewhat failed to organize my ideas because I have too many ideas. So I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to organize this collection of ideas into, but I'm hoping to find some kind of conclusion whilst I simply go through and talk about all of the ideas that are raised for me by this wonderful novel by Arthur C Clarke, which I have quite a history with. My history of science fiction reading is shaped by the bookshelves of my mother that I grew up with. I grew up in a single-parent family, myself and my mother. I have elder siblings who had already left home when I was very young. So my mother is a huge influence. My mother, Mary Walter, on my reading and my thinking generally. And she had these amazing bookshelves full of many books and lots of science fiction. I am a third-generation science fiction fan. So there was all of the science fiction that my mother loved, and also books from my grandfather, who was a collector of people like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. And one of the writers that my mum really liked was Arthur C Clarke. She had a big collection of his books. I read them all, I guess when I was like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, kind of through those years. And the one that I read over and over again was The Fountains of Paradise, which I believe to be Arthur C Clarke's masterpiece. In some ways, I think something of a forgotten masterpiece. In the science fiction community, we ran recently a poll for what was the best novel by Arthur C Clarke, and The Fountains of Paradise didn't even make it into the top 10. It only received 4 votes. And of course, 2001, and I think Childhood's End, which I'm struggling to pronounce, won by quite a large margin. And then it was 2001, and then it was Rendezvous with Rama. But the book, which I think is actually Clarke's masterpiece, wasn't even in the top 10. And I think this is because culturally it's been somewhat forgotten, which is surprising because at the time of its publication in 1979, it was the pinnacle of Clarke's career. I'm going to call him Clarke, not to be rude, but because just repeating Arthur C Clarke over and over again, I don't think is going to be pleasing for anybody. So Arthur C Clarke, ACC. I might go with ACC or just Clarke. We'll see. But in 1979, this was very much the pinnacle of ACC's career. He proclaimed it as his retirement novel. It was going to be the last novel that he wrote. That didn't turn out to be the case. It was a bestseller beyond much of the work that Clarke had published before. It won the Hugo and the Nebula Award and a bunch of other awards across 1979 and 1980. 80. And it has quite a place in Clarke's career. I think you can divide up the career arc of Arthur C. Clarke into 3 phases. The first phase of about 20 years is kind of formative into productive. So ACC is discovering himself as a science fiction writer. He's joining the ranks already of the great science fiction writers. This is the period sometimes called, I would call it like the late golden age through the 1940s and 50s. It's the late 40s, the 50s, and the 1960s that Clarke is emerging as a writer. He's writing some great science fiction. He's being considered alongside Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein as the big 3 of science fiction. But he is one of many science fiction writers. And his work is, well, it depends. If you like core golden age science fiction, it's pretty amazing. If you don't, it won't stand out to you particularly, not least because many of the ideas in it have been copied ad infinitum. And then, of course, ACC hits the great year in his career, 1968, or the few years leading up to 1968, and he's working with Stanley Kubrick on 2001, A Space Odyssey. And this kicks off a 10-year period, kind of a decade or more, of Arthur C. Clarke's work from the late 60s through to the late 70s. And this is the most productive and creative. And he has a 10-year period of writing just some great novels. So you have Rendezvous with Rama in there, many others. And this isn't unusual for very great novelists because it's really difficult to maintain that fever pitch of work or to get to it for all of that long. So a solid decade of great work. Philip K. Dick was quite similar when we looked at his career arc. Many writers only really appear into the public consciousness during that peak of their career. But of course, Clarke had that earlier 20 years of working within this emerging, growing genre of science fiction. So he has this very long career, but it's that 10 years, 68 to 79, culminating in The Fountains of Paradise. But then actually he doesn't retire. He has quite a long career, really, as a public intellectual. He has another life as a television presenter, as a writer of lots and lots of non-fiction works. He talks a lot about this borderline space between science and fiction. Really, you have things like The Mysteries of Arthur C. Clarke, where he talks a bit about things like UFOs, and good on him. And there's also lots of ghostwriting during this period. He's writing with Gentry Lee, with Stephen Baxter, and you have a good two decades more of Arthur C. Clarke. But it's that 68 to 79 period where the really great work happens, and that's ended with The Fountains of Paradise. If you, like I, adore the storytelling of Arthur C. Clarke, and if you would like to explore further how to write hard science fiction with poetic beauty, how to combine scientific speculation with symbolism, with themes, with myth, then there's going to be a special workshop for members of the Science Fiction Podcast. You can join on YouTube, a few dollars a month. Go along to damiangwalter.com and you will find a full workshop on how to lift your hard science fiction writing up to that level of poetic beauty that Arthur C. Clarke was so skilled at. There is some discussion about whether writers like Arthur C. Clarke are good fiction writers. And there's a couple of ways that you can look at this. If what you're looking for in the novel is the introspection into the inner life of a human being, of a character being presented, and understanding their inner monologue and how it weaves into their experience of the world, this thing that the novel does very powerfully over its 200-300-year evolution, then by that standard, Arthur C Clarke is not a particularly good novelist. And that's because that's not what Arthur C Clarke is doing. In really all of his novels, Clarke is writing about engineering projects, be that landing on a giant alien artifact that's shooting through the solar system, or be that the construction of an orbital tower, a space elevator. And if you understand that that's what Arthur C Clarke is doing, then he's a phenomenal writer. Because very few writers can, firstly, imagine, speculate on that process of science and engineering combining to produce a mega structure like a space elevator up to geosynchronous orbit. And then do what Clarke does, which is weave layers of symbolism around that story of an engineering project. And this is what makes Fountains of Paradise so great. It's this combination of a really great hard science fiction narrative, the construction of an orbital tower and the man who constructs it, and layers of symbolism around that. And it's really the symbolism that I want to dig into. But before I do, let's talk a bit more about the story. Are there going to be spoilers? No, I don't really think so. I'll avoid what happens within the narrative of the construction of the tower. But it's also not really a story that knowing what happens is going to spoil it for you. If you really want to and you haven't read Fountains of Paradise, it's a short book, hit pause for maybe a few hours or a couple of days, read the book and then come back. Otherwise, I promise you it's not going to spoil it for you. So the central character is Vannevar Morgan. I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation, unfortunately, who is the ultimate competent engineer. And these are the characters who are very often at the center of Clarke's novels, or more generally, the hard science fiction subgenre that we are talking about here. And Clarke's characters are also often civil servants or bureaucrats who are also in the role of scientist or engineer, unlike, say, more libertarian visions, someone like Neil Stephenson, who we may mention later in this discussion. Clarke is interested in the engineer who is working for the public good. These are not crazed industrialists. These are not the Elon Musks of the world. These are people who are leveraging the full resources of the state, of the public sector, to build these great engineering projects. And in his way, therefore, Clarke was reflecting his times, because he's writing here at the very end of the space race age, coming into the space shuttle age, when it was, of course, public finance that was paying for all of this. And Vannevar Morgan is two things. He is this technocrat, the head of a giant agency for building big engineering projects on the planet Earth and beyond. But he's also very ambitious. And we're getting into the ambition of this kind of character. So the inner life of Morgan isn't very important. We don't know much about him as a frail human being, because we're watching someone who is in the role of the great creator and thinking about the ambitions that drive him. And we'll come back to that discussion of ambition. Let's think a bit more about the science. One of the reasons that Clarke is so admired and famous, because of that admiration, is because he made so many great scientific predictions in the medium of science fiction. The most famous of those is geosynchronous orbit. I don't know precisely if nobody else spoke about it. I'm sure other scientific minds were getting there, but Clarke described it, he wrote about it, and I think it's often called the Clarke orbit as a consequence. And geosynchronous orbit also plays a role in the space elevator orbital tower idea. Because to make a space elevator, this is loosely what you do. You build a tower on Earth. It may need to be something like 50 kilometers tall, itself a massive engineering project. And you build it directly beneath a suitably large satellite that is in geosynchronous orbit. So it stays directly, pretty much, above that point on the planet Earth. The distance between these 2 points is something like 36,000 kilometers. It's a pretty long way, which is relevant because you're then going to stretch a cable between your tower and your orbiting satellite. Of course, it has to be a geosynchronous, because otherwise this thing would slowly wrap itself around the planet Earth, and it wouldn't even be possible to do it. It's that geosynchronous position which keeps the forces involved within certain parameters. So what's the really hard problem here? It's not the satellite, it's not even the tower, it's not even stretching the cable. It's what material are you going to make this cable from? And the genius of Clarke was to see that there was a potential material, which he describes as something like pseudo one-dimensional diamond crystal. The basic point being that it's carbon. It's an arrangement of carbon atoms that produce something very strong as diamond. Because any other material, if you made a steel cable, the kind of cable that we use for long spans of suspension bridges, for instance, it not only wouldn't survive the forces at play in reaching 36,000 kilometers, it wouldn't maintain that length under its own weight. So you need a material that can do that. And there isn't such a material, but Clarke was able to speculate in 1979 that there would be, and then it would be some arrangement of carbon. He also speculated that it might be Buckminster fullerene. Buckminster Fuller had done a lot of thinking about geodesic domes for construction, that you also might be able to make a similar structure on the atomic scale from carbon atoms. I'm really at the edge of my materials science here, but carbon atoms are among the best for doing this because they can be arranged into these structures with the least wastefulness. So at the atomic level, there is the least leftover atomic structure, so they can do it at the lightest weight. And amazingly, Clarke was right about this. Then when you come into the 90s, we start to make discoveries of carbon structures that might be able to do this, and we will come back to that. So this is why Clarke is considered, the pinnacle of hard science fiction writers, when in the Facebook community we polled the greatest ever hard science fiction writer, Arthur C Clarke won with nobody coming close, because this is an amazing act of speculation. So then The Fountains of Paradise really tells the story of what happens over actually a span of many years to build the space elevator. And you have early experimentation with taking a long length of this carbon diamond filament, which is super thin. So early in the book, Morgan Vanavar, he uses it to impress people about the potential of the project, he kind of uses it to slice through solid objects because it's so razor sharp. So what we have is Clarke's then speculation about how this engineering project would unfold over a number of decades. And as that happens, the story ties in with some other elements of what I colloquially call the Clarkeverse, which was Clarke's vision of an attainable space-born future for the human race. Attainable because it is really only encompasses the solar system, and particularly the inner planets of the solar system. Clarke's vision here, I think, has influenced things like The Expanse. Because Clarke is hard-nosed. He doesn't think we're going to invent hyperdrive and shoot off to the stars, but he does think that maybe we'll get some visitors from the stars. So in a kind of echo of Rendezvous with Rama, a craft called Sundiver comes hurtling through the solar system during the course of Fountains of Paradise and then hurtles off again. And also at the end of Fountains of Paradise, we have this vision of an Earth encircled by ring systems based on these towers. And Clarke has also spoken about that, or I believe he will speak about it later in 3001, which is, I think, the fourth novel of the 2001 quadrilogy, where he embellishes this a bit more, that in the year 3001, there will be kind of multiple rings around the Earth, many space elevators, orbital towers leading up to them. And I call this Clarkeverse. I think here that Clarke coined a neglected area of science fiction that I think there's much more interest in, which is low orbit science fiction. What is humanity's future in this geosynchronous orbit of the planet? And I think I want to talk about this a little bit more in my list of ideas about the Fountains of Paradise. But first, let's come back to the thing that Clarke does so well here, which is symbolism. The symbolism that he weaves around this hard science fiction story. Some of this symbolism is biographical. So one of the engineering questions is, where do you route your space elevator, your orbital tower? Well, it has to be somewhere on the equator because that is free of hurricanes. And so Clarke puts it basically on the island of Sri Lanka. But it's a fictionalized version of the island of Sri Lanka, so he can put a fictionalized history on there. To an extent, then, Vannevar Morgan is Arthur C Clarke. It is a kind of embodiment of his way of seeing the world. And Clarke had lived in Sri Lanka for many years at this point, and he clearly wanted to tell a story about Sri Lanka and its mythology. And also, where symbolism comes from is the deep imagination of the creator, the writer, the storyteller. And after many decades living in Sri Lanka, it had seeped into Clarke's bones and into his unconscious and into his imagination. And it came out in the writing of the story and in the layers of symbolism that he weaves into the story. So one layer of this symbolism is the novum at the heart of the story. And the novum is not the space tower itself. It is the hyperfilament that allows the construction of the space tower, that allows early in the story Vannevar Morgan to dangle from a mountain face just using this hyperfilament because it's so strong it can easily carry his body weight. Early in the story, he dangles from the hyperfilament. Then later in the story, towards the conclusion of the story, there's an emergency situation on the space elevator on this massively long fiber cable stretching out 36,000 kilometers into space. And Vannevar Morgan is once again dangling from the cable that he has created. So there's something here almost superpowered that I don't believe Morgan is the creator of the hyperfilament, but he's understood its purpose. He's had it made through his resources at the Tehran Development Agency. And then he builds a tower from it. So it's the creative will of humankind embodied in this novum, the new idea at the heart of the story, which is the hyperfilament. And every part of the story, this is what's significant and poetic about using a novum, is that every part of the story relates to it in some way or another. Every character, every event, and every symbol connects back to the hyperfilament as novum. There's then a beautiful mythic moment, mythic, symbolic, meaningful. On the island of Taprabani, the fictionalized version of Sri Lanka, is a Buddhist monastery. And the Buddhist monastery occupies the mountaintop where they want to build the tower. And the Buddhist monks say, no, we're not going to give you the land. And the world court adjudicates and says it's theirs, you can't just take it. And so Vannevar Morgan goes off to Mars for a while, speculates on building an easier orbital tower project on Mars because the gravity is less, the distance to geosynchronous orbit is less. And then in a beautiful moment, there is a prophecy that the soldiers of King Kalidasa will one day tell the monks to leave the temple. And these soldiers are represented in yellow butterflies. And the yellow butterflies are sometimes blown up the mountain, but they've never made it to the temple. And then on the day that Morgan is attempting his first length of hyperfilament from space up to the ground of the island of Taprabani, the weather control elements who are trying to prevent any weather getting in the way, it goes wrong, because in this future of 2100 plus, they're able to control the atmospheric systems. But this goes wrong, and the storm that stops Vannevar Morgan's experiment also blows the butterflies all the way up to the temple. The prophecy is fulfilled. The monks believe they have to leave, and Vannevar Morgan is able to build his tower. An act of science that can only be completed because of the fulfillment of a holy prophecy. Very interesting collision of beliefs. And Clarke, as the hardest of hard science fiction writers, was also a very interesting and intelligent mythic thinker. And he liked to play with ideas of both science and religion and spirituality together. And he does this really even more so in the great thematic element of the Fountains of Paradise, because we have on one hand this story of a great creator, a scientific and engineer creator, building his tower to space, the tower that will finally make him famous. And this is mirrored, echoed in what you might call it the primary narrative. It's where the story starts in Fountains of Paradise, of the King Kalidasa. And the King Kalidasa is the king some 2,000 years earlier of the island of Taprabani, Sri Lanka. And he is building pleasure gardens around his mountain palace. And he is shaping the palace into a lion form. And this is the famous mountain at the heart of Sri Lanka's mythic history. And Kalidasa is driven to do this. He kills people to do it. He enslaves people to do it. He fights wars to do it. And so we have these two figures of great will, a mythic king and a modern scientist. And we follow both their stories and we see how they interweave. And of course, in the extract that I open this podcast with, we see that it's Kalidasa who wins. Even though it's Vannevar Morgan who builds the tower to space, it's Kalidasa whose name remains attached to it. I'm not sure what the meaning of that beautiful piece of poetic symbolism is. I think there's lots of space for interpretation, but I think the wider theme is quite clear. That Clarke is talking to us about the ways that our evolution as humanity, which has ended in the biological sense, we no longer evolve biologically. We may have some directions of biological evolution ahead of us, but we are now primarily engaged in cultural evolution. And that evolution is driven by huge scale acts of engineering, of science and engineering. We have two of these: the construction of the fountains of paradise and the construction of the orbital tower. And we have this title, The Fountains of Paradise, because, of course, this is our dream as a human species, is that our science, our technology, and our engineering will take us to the fountains of paradise, to, if not a utopian future, a far better future. And it is these huge engineering projects that can take us there. And that is the beautiful theme that Clarke explores and leads us with in that final coda to the story, where we go far into the future and we see the future that both Kalidasa and Morgan and many other great creators of humankind have built for us. And it's beautiful and it's calming. I think the reason why I read Fountains of Paradise 5 or 6 times as a kid, and I've read it now twice, again, as an adult, and it stands up to rereading. You know, I think it has a few weaknesses. I think the final act is a little bit based around kind of one danger adventure event. I won't say any more than that. Maybe the final act could have gone a bit further into the future, but that's, you know, it's a fairly trivial criticism there of what is such a beautiful novel. And part of that beauty is the idea that human life, human civilization, our past and our future can have an order provided by science, technology, engineering, by the kind of calm, rational mind of Vannevar Morgan and, of course, of Arthur C Clarke. And we spend a lot of time in Clarke's orderly view of existence. And it's very pleasing and pleasurable. But he's intuitive enough as a storyteller to contrast that with the brutalities of the past, how our progress was achieved in the era of King Kalidasa. And all of this raises a powerful question. I'm reminding myself, I want to get back to the question of human progress and how it is intertwined with large-scale engineering projects. And I think the question of whether in the 20th century we picked the right projects. And to get there, I think we need to ask the question, could we and should we build a space elevator? Because that hasn't been our primary choice for exploring space. Of course, space exploration has been entwined with building rockets, powerful, controlled, explosive vehicles to take us into orbit. But there is an alternative vision that we could build a space elevator. And of course, the first objection might be that we have rocket technology, but we don't have space elevator technology. So the question arises, could we build a space elevator? Is it possible? So the basic challenges include geography. Can we find a location? The answer is yes, we have. We could actually use many locations. It's just a question of how difficult that specific location would be and how resistant the tower would have to be to things like hurricanes and other high-speed wind forces. But the basic answer is yes, either with a fixed tower or on a mobile base station, perhaps a very large ship at sea, or something more like an oil rig, maybe. Yes, we can build a big tower somewhere on Earth. Can we build it 50 kilometers tall? We'd never done it. We'd never even come close. But, engineeringly, there's categories of things. There's things that are impossible for the moment, things like going faster than the speed of light, and there's things that are difficult. And there's things that we think we should be able to do, we just haven't done yet. And a 50-kilometer tower is something in that category. We should be able to do that. We just haven't done it yet. It's just a very hard engineering problem to solve. So the real question is materials. And this is where you might say that looking from the 1960s, when we were initiating the space programs, 50s and 60s, we didn't have the materials. We weren't going to be able to build a space elevator even with aluminium or steel or titanium cables. I'm not a materials scientist, but I do know enough to say that we now have a set of materials. And the strongest of these is the carbon nanotube. So we have a set of materials that are all arrangements of carbon atoms. We have graphene, which is flat layers of carbon atoms, which is a very powerful, I believe, semiconductor. It's being used for that purpose. There's lots of potential uses of graphene in battery technology. And then if you take that flat layer and wrap it into a tube, you get, I think, a carbon nanotube. And the carbon nanotube is potentially 6 times stronger than the calculated material strength needed to build an orbital tower, to build a cable to space. And then you put many of those cables together and you basically have an orbital tower. And this was the conclusion of a 1999 NASA workshop, which brought together all of the leading practitioners that would be needed, scientific thinkers, experts, and they concluded that it couldn't yet be done, but it would be possible, and that was in 1999. Since then, an organization has been formed, the International Space Elevator Consortium, the International Space Elevator Consortium, led by Peter Swan. And just a year ago, Peter Swan made this statement: if one were to think of space elevators as an evolutionary approach for humans to leave the surface of the Earth, then one starts to recognize the essential step that must be taken. It is revolutionary in that it changes the equation of delivery dynamics. Rocket equation limiting versus massive movement of logistical cargo while it fulfills the customer's needs. It has so many promises and is seen as an enabler for so many dreams that it must be pursued now. And that was a year ago, March 2021. From Peter Swan. I have tried to contact Peter Swan. I haven't been able to get hold of him. Peter, if this goes viral and you hear it, contact me. Come on the Science Fiction Podcast and we'll talk about the possibilities. Because it seems to me, from my inexpert, highly speculative view, that we're now in the range where this is as possible as any great dream, and we should bally well do it. We should build the space elevator, the orbital tower, and I think we should build it for the reasons that Peter Swan and Arthur C Clarke outlined. This is about human evolution. That once the tower is built, it allows us to move so much cargo up at much lower cost that low orbit space becomes much more useful. And that's the real question. What has been limiting us in our visions of space exploration and becoming a space-borne species is our motivation for doing so. There's currently, I think, season 3 of For All Mankind coming up. And I want to level a bit of a criticism For All Mankind, because this is a speculative science fiction television show. that poses the alternate reality. What would happen if we had continued the vast public spending required for the space race? We would be on the moon by now, and in season 3, we would be going to Mars. And I want to level the critique that this is something of a fantasy, a particular boomer fantasy, the baby boomer generation, who are really hung up on the idea that if we had just continued very high level public spending, which we did in many ways, but on everything, then so many things would be better. And for all mankind is kind of this fantasy. It looks realistic, but actually this isn't how space exploration would happen. When humanity stretches into new realms of exploration, be it exploring the entire country be it crossing a continent, be it crossing an ocean to form colonies on other continents, we do this because of wealth transfer frontiers. I'm borrowing a term there from the evolutionary scientist Brett Weinstein, who I quite like. I think some of Brett Weinstein's work goes in directions I find a little bit, to use the nightmare word, problematic. But in many ways, I think he is a very interesting and innovative thinker, and he has this idea of wealth transfer frontiers, because what drives human exploration is some level of self-interest and, sadly, greed. And sadly, some of our very negative societal manifestations. And whilst it's a beautiful dream to think that we're going to go into space purely through taxation and public funding, just to fulfill the dream of John F. Kennedy, that we do this not because it's easy, but because it is hard, that's not what drives human civilization. Human civilization is driven by finding new sources of wealth. And when we colonized America, it was a massive wealth transfer frontier. Sadly, a lot of that wealth was taken from native people, something we need to put right in many ways, now that we feel we have the resources to do so, and the vision and the understanding of our crimes of the past. But the wealth transfer frontier was there, and it brought generations of people to find wealth. And what we haven't found is a wealth transfer frontier, because the cost of rocketry is far too great to be offset against any accessible kind of wealth. But the space elevator opens a real frontier. A real frontier in low Earth orbit, because with the space elevator, we can drag up enough resources to create orbital factories, and those factories can create wealth that cannot be created on Earth, not because there is anything present in low Earth orbit, but because there is something absent, which is gravity, which is the gravitational force of Earth. It's not entirely zero G. The microgravity of the substances that we take up there will still exist. But without Earth's gravitational force, it's very likely, almost certain, that we can make the next generation of semiconductors, that we can make breakthroughs in biomedical sciences, that we can produce new molecular structures like drugs, and a whole host of other high technologies that can be achieved in low orbit. Low orbit is the place where we're going. We're not just going through there to get to Mars. It's unclear what the wealth transfer frontier at Mars would be. There probably will be one later, but we need the attainable goal. And the attainable goal is the orbital tower, the space elevator, using carbon super strong filaments to take us up to that 36,000 kilometer geosynchronous level where we can build factories and make high technologies that produce new wealth, and then we bring them back down. And this is what will drive true space exploration. So this is perhaps a message from a speculative thinker to the great creators and scientists and engineers and dreamers, maybe Elon Musk, but I don't think he's the guy for this. another generation of Vannevar Morgans or King Kalidasas. What's the real attainable vision for humankind that we need you, with your passion and your self-sacrifice, to fulfill? One day, it will be the stars. One day, it will be the solar system. But today, it's low orbit of Earth. That's where we can get to. We have the technology to do it. I believe that in my crazed, speculative, sci-fi way of thinking. Let me know if you agree. Come and talk on the science fiction community. Come and talk on Twitter. Ask me your questions for the upcoming question and answer episode of Science Fiction with Damien Walter. And also, come and join the workshop. There's going to be something like an hour-long workshop on writing hard science fiction with a poetic edge. That great thing that made Arthur C Clarke so powerful and profound a storyteller. How do we create the hard SF with realistic visions of where we're going as humans, speculations on science and technology and engineering progress, and weave them, as Arthur C Clarke did, with poetry, symbolism, mythic, thematic, brilliant, wonderful storytelling. So please become a member. That workshop is exclusively for members of science fiction. You can join on YouTube. I think it's currently $4.99 a month. You will find the workshop there. Or even better, come along to damiengwalter.com. Join up as a member. Any monthly donation, give $1, $3, $7, whatever you want. And you will get the Writing Hard SF workshop. You will get all of the other workshops. You will get all of my courses, and you will get invitations to the science fiction seminars. Thank you so much for listening for something like an hour. I'm sure if you have listened all the way that you, as I, love the novels of Arthur C Clarke, particularly The Fountains of Paradise, but all the others. So I'm going to sign off with a thank you, wherever you are now, ACC, probably looking over us as the star child, the next step in human evolution that you speculated upon so beautifully. Thank you for all of your contributions. And I hope that vision from 1979, Arthur C Clarke's vision of the construction of the orbital tower, of how many thousands of years later it would provide that next step in human evolution. I hope we can fulfill that truly. Thank you very much. This is Science Fiction with Damien Walter. Thank you and goodbye.